Hello, everyone. I'm Jerry Lopez. Glad to meet you. There are some people I did not expect at all, from not that far and very far, and some people who were very close who I didn't expect at all, and others who I expected, and it's still a high to be with you. And then Norwalk, right, was a total surprise because Luis Vega, who's sitting right there, who's their teacher, and one of the two people, was bringing students to the March 2020 bus and everything set up, and then life took over. And so when we were planning it again, I reached out to him and to Anna, who has also brought students, saying, hey, blah, blah, and Luis said, okay, I've gone through the hoops, but heaven only knows, right? Because if you're dealing with a school district or a school, it's not just law school. And I couldn't have been more surprised because I didn't hear back, and I just figured he was letting me down easy, right? But someone was talking to Dale Manami for a few minutes after the panel, a friend of his who's quite wonderful, and saying to him that Dale always says, I don't know what I'm doing, Shauna, what are you forcing on me? I can't read it. You know, what tenure piece are you talking about when he wrote it? And then, this is all true. And then she said to him, like, Dale, like, you suddenly come to life. You know, before you're acting like you're 140, which is accurate. And then when you're here, you're suddenly the same young dude who founded the Asian Law Caucus with other wild people, which was itself a wild thing. But her point was, like, it was already beautiful to see it passed down across generations, which is what any number of people here do, even some of you are quite young. But to have, like, high school kids, come on. The only thing that would have been the equivalent is there are two people here who are great, brilliant preschool people. And I wanted them to bring the preschoolers. They both know it. They're still here, and maybe they will tomorrow, right? Because if this woman, Dale's friend, was right, then we ought to start early, right? There is no reason to wait, and law school is way too late. So there's been a lot of change-ups. One is somebody far better than me should have been in my moderating role and couldn't. So for a lot of reasons I said, okay, I can be the moderator and have the panel carry me, which is the way I love working. You know, that I work and somebody else really is good, right? And I try each day to be a quarter as good, and even if we don't win the thing, we work so damn well together that I get the high out of their goodness. But then in the last 2 days, Eric Cohen, who is the executive director of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, in my view, the best immigration outfit in the country, founded in this scrappy, crazy, you can't imagine it could be done way by Bill Hing in 1979. He's sick, been sick for 3 weeks, had a chest cold that the doctor thinks is going to turn into pneumonia, and he was going to fly. And he said, you know, I'll wear a mask, and if I'm coughing too much, I'll get off the dais. I said, like, you know, I don't know what to tell you, but... And you know how he tried to cure himself? He was running. You know, old school, let me cough it up, which was, of course, driving it further into his chest. This is all God's honest, right? And so finally, his life's partner and I said, you can't get on the plane. It's not about getting better. It's about getting well. Right? You got a lot of life to lead. And meanwhile, Mona Tao Tao, who's one of the spectacular people and lawyers I have ever met, we've had many conversations, right? She worked First time I met her was, she worked in legal services in San Fernando Valley, where it was a dysfunctional office, and she made it as sane as could be, and it was just mind-boggling. And then she moved up to Sacramento in what I do think may well have been the best legal services office in the country for X number of years. And Bill in particular worked a lot with them. And I knew them, and we both know the other person who was amazing. And there were some graduates from here who went up there. And the other day she said, oh, I've got a little bit of a cold. But I tested and it was negative. And I've never had it. Oh my God, don't tell me that. And sure enough, yesterday, it's COVID. I think it's light, I think it's fine. So I was being carried by 4 great people. That's why I signed up. And I was about to say, like, let somebody else be the facilitator, right? Because 2 people probably, as great as they are, can't carry me. But I told them, you are now going to carry me alone. I won't, as Shauna didn't, tell you more about them than you can read, right? But in order, right? Maisha is the head of human resources at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And she is, yes. And she knows the sort of belly of the beast of institutions, from now large nonprofits to, before that, the corporate world, and what it means to kind of understand the world of what are we doing, what makes it work, what kind of people are we looking for, what kind of people do we promote, what kind of people do we have to get rid of. Because if you're the ILRC and from the beginning, much like Dale's caucus, without any term like rebellious, you were already rebellious, then the idea is you better work that way no matter who you are, or really this isn't your place. Next to her is my brother in secret warfare against the world, Sherrod Thaxton, whose go-to stuff really is formerly a public defender and still heavily involved in death penalty work, right? And he's written some of the great stuff ever about it, which, yes, Dale, is long, and yes, Dale, you should read it. But unlike other people, right, when all this fight was going on about really affirmative action is wrong for all kinds of reasons, but among the reasons are it actually hurts those of us who have benefited. Some people took on the challenge, but nobody took on the challenge the way he did, right? Partly that's true. Remember, he was tenured track and not tenured, and the person he was principally challenging works here. Secondly, he's just got chops like few people have, because as it happens, he's a numbers guy, right? He doesn't even like talking to me, really. He just sends me numbers, which is true. And then he's got this fancy math stuff, right? So he doesn't really even deal with law types. There's like this super elite group who are all progressive, and they just throw numbers at each other and new algorithms for how you can suss out stuff that everybody else denies. Like, you know, like a queer woman doesn't get discriminated against. Oh. Really? All right, let's just see. Because if you don't believe her, and don't believe other people around her, well, you believe numbers, huh? Okay. So, 2 bigger changes, right? I've now got to talk a lot more. And I really, when I'm doing these things, boy, do I love talking very little. I know that seems odd for those of you who know me well, but it's true. So I'm going to be a co-participant. Some of the time I'm going to be Mona. Maybe I'll tell you, maybe I won't. Some of the time I'm going to be Eric, and then once in a while I'll be me, which you'll probably be able to pick out. But here's the other thing that you've got to vibe with me to make happen, right? You've got to vibe with me to make happen. These 2 are uncommonly polite. Like, I don't know which side of the black traditions they come from, but they, like, give you room, right? Give you room. They kind of think they're only supposed to, like, you know, occupy this much, and they said it well and don't go any further. And so I have said to them, you are supposed to, like, take up space. Be you. Don't be professionally nice. I don't mean in the sense they won't speak the truth, They just think they're supposed to share, right? Well, I don't want them to share equally, right? So you've got to like vibe it up to say like, what's up? Right? Like, what's up? Speak, speak, right? And I've warned them, so they all knew that I not only insisted with them, they knew I was going to tell you, because I need help. They're really hard to get off their polite thing, right? And right now, I need them not to be polite, right? I need them to be all that they got and taking up a lot of stuff. So Mona likely would have been the person to say, okay, how did we get here, right? So we seem to be responding to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. For all Norwalk young people in the room, I don't know how much you know, but it's a decision that said, okay, for purposes of looking at people of color, applying to colleges, you can no longer take race into account in deciding whether or not they should become part of it, right? Big decision. And it is important in all kinds of ways, though we won't be talking about like the little particulars, right? But it helps to go back, right? And if Dale's actually, I think, 70 years older than me, but I think I'm 272. Bill and Shauna and Gary Peck are all younger. But this, a little narrative snippet, right? When I went to college, there were 2 other Latinos I ever met until my senior year. So 3 people. One was somebody who I played sports against all the time. And he was the first team high school All-American quarterback who sadly and for the most horrific reasons washed out by his freshman year. And the other one stayed around and was a great guy. I knew no Latinas. Maybe they were there, but I didn't know them. Now, Dale might say, if you went to class, you might have seen somebody. Fair enough. But I walked the campus occasionally. I did not know a black woman until my sophomore year. Never saw one, didn't know one. And throughout my 4 years, I never met a black man who was not on athletic ride. Now, here's the thing Dale would correct me on because he knows more. But when I met Dale at 17, right, on the basketball court, Dale can ball. Like Dale can really play. I only knew Dale and 2 other Asians on the whole campus. So this idea of model minority was always such a surprise to me. Like, when did you guys get smart? I mean, there was only 3 of you at my time. I mean, like, what the heck happened? And I used to say that to him, like, when did this mythology come into being? I'm being blunt, right? Because all the ones I knew, right, were from places like Gardena or Watts or East LA, and like, they were just normal folks, right? So like all this, but that was it, right? When I went to law school, let's keep going. When I went to law school, 4 other Latinos in my class, 2 the year before them, 1 the year before that, and a myth that there was once an American-born Latino from the 1940s, right? That's the total. Asians, 1 Asian man in all 3 years in my class. He was also a basketball player, good dude, Japanese dude, from LA, so we got on. There were a larger number of black folks, but only because Harvard had decided earlier on, for particularized reasons, to go to historically black colleges. So there'd been a bit of a funnel. But just to get straight what the times were like, right? I don't know if any of you would guess this. The total number of women in my first year class, 9%. 9% of women in my whole first year class. So now that I've told you the numbers, picture what, because each one of the classes was 600 people. Picture what 1,800 first through third year people would look like, given that I've just told you the number of women and people of color. Now, there, I had even better reason not to go to class. So fast forward, right? Everybody is talking as if these new decisions are calamitous, and they might be. But they're also frequently talking in many other parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, as if it's the first time ever. And that's just grotesquely uninformed. Because what state, more than any other state, has already lived this? The state of California. All right, so Norwalk kids, do you know any of this? You ready? Right? Suddenly, places like UCLA in 1993, 1994, it really was beginning to look like LA's demographics, right? You'd walk across campus and go like, my God, how come I didn't go to school at this time? I wanted to go back and enroll. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was never going to go to class. But I was just going to be there to walk around campus. Like, what the hell? Really? We really desegregated this place? So, in the middle of what had been a recession, and with Governor Pete Wilson trying desperately to become the presidential candidate, he first pushed the ugliest anti-immigrant bill at that point in time, other than great historical stuff. It was called Proposition 187, right? And it was as ugly as anything people now imagine in Texas. And it passed, and passed big. And right after that, he was all over, I'm going to kill affirmative action, both for race and gender. So no more, right? And all this was about, he thought that was the wave he had to ride to get the presidential nomination, right? And Prop 209 was and is a vicious thing, right? Because they were very clever. Don't underestimate how clever opponents can be for a moment, right? They just didn't pass a law. It was an amendment to the California Constitution, right? So it means ostensibly, everything that we kind of follow, this is what's going to define it. So here's the big deal, right? That passed in 1996. And from 1996 through today, race and gender, right, can't be taken into account. But here's the big thing to start off with, right? Don't think it's just about higher education. You know, and the fancy cases are about Harvard and North Carolina, blah, 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 right? 209 was all about the only two schools that anybody seemed to care about, Berkeley and UCLA, blah, 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 right? 209 was about not only every other school, it was about everything that the state, county, and local governments do. Everything. Everything, everything, everything. You make it up, right? How do they do their work on the streets? They used to take account of race and gender for hiring and promotion. No way. No way. How do they contract out, as they do to the tune of billions of dollars? The only thing that had ever desegregated the contracting community was affirmative action, right? Less even than discrimination suits. Gone. But to tell you how vicious they were, so don't think anybody's more vicious today than they were then. Two things. They banned race and gender, true story, in trying to figure out all the information they needed to know in neonatal care. Now think about that just for a moment, right? Biggest one of all was, Wilson says to the head of his person, who kind of, it's like a weird job, but the state is filled with weird jobs, as Martha Gomez could tell you, right? This was the person who kind of dictates what kind of information gets gathered, right? They said, you can no longer keep information about race or gender. Think about that. So now, of course, the first thing you should say to yourself, like Norwalk, is you should say, like, wait a second. If they're not keeping this information, right, then how do we even know that affirmative action is not in gear, right? Because don't you have to have race information and gender information to know if somebody's cheating, which is what they were concerned about? But the other thing is, of course, our side of it. Well, if you don't have that damn information, how are we supposed to be working on all the discrimination suits, which we know are justified. There's just not enough people to bring them. But Pete Wilson and those characters weren't playing. And they weren't playing in precisely the way that today's people aren't playing. Yes, it's about education, but anybody who just marks it off as if that's somehow a wall, and not about hiring and promotion, not about health, not about contracting, and you keep on going with all that you know about life, they're living in some fantasy world. Now, there are fights to be fought, right? There are fights to be fought, and this will take time, but it's serious. But the first thing you all should know, and know our kids in particular, right, because Anna sent me this lovely text of one of the young people she was trying to bring, and that young person said, this was from LA Unified, Anna, can you help me? Because they have only particular rules about, excused absences. And going to this conference with you is not regarded as an excused absence at LA Unified School District. And if you want to know one of the 10,000 reasons I would abolish LA Unified School District, that sums it up. But Norwalk, the biggest thing you should know, right, is that that person was saying, this is the first time I will go to a UC campus ever. This is an LA girl, right, who's not far away at all. So she gets a chance to go because this lawyer who works as an organizer and a bunch of other things brings them. Like, oh, no, the technical stuff. So Norwalk kids, this is your home. More than it's my home. And I mean, you got to own that. You walk around this place like it's yours. You don't walk around like, oh my God, am I a stranger? Am I a visitor? It's yours. It's yours. The more you act like you own it, the more soon you'll start to feel like you own it. So today, even more than in 1994, 1995, and 1996 in California in the run-up, the arguments against affirmative action are many, but let's summarize. 3, I'll make them up. They're actually the biggest ones. I'm not making any of this up. One is like, well, what the hell? What happened to colorblind merit? Because that's who we've always wanted to be, already to a considerable degree achieved, and this is just a grotesque violation, right? Secondly, like, wow, and it hurts other people, right? Just think of all the people who aren't going to get in because of the people who are going to get in about race-conscious affirmative action. And then the final big kicker, right, is the idea that, well, it doesn't just hurt the other people, but all those young people of color or all those contractors of color, go down the list, all those young people of color who get into these schools, they're really mismatched. That's what they call it, mismatched. What does mismatch mean? Well, hate to tell you, they're not really good enough to be there. And with affirmative action, right, you're putting them in some place where they're going to just get trounced. And even if they hang in there, they're not going to feel good about themselves. So we should match all these people of color with some other place way down the line. Now, who knows? Way down the line might be the best education in the world. But if this is just a notion of like, hey, there's this hierarchy, right? It starts way on top. And you know, people of color who get in like, man, that's a bad match, and you're hurting them most of all. They go through life thinking like, well, I didn't think it was mine, and then I got there and I really realized it was mine, and like, what the hell? So we're going to start with charade, right? Because no one in the country has ever taken on mismatch theory and other lies told about affirmative action like charade.
Thank you. I appreciate that very generous introduction and also the excellent framing. And I'm going to talk about mismatch and some of those boring numbers, and I'll try to, which can be impersonal. But before, I want to stick with your theme as past this prologue and tell a more kind of personal story, kind of about my point of entry into this debate long before I knew this was actually my point of entry in the debate. And then I'll get back to some of those boring numbers. And like you, I really do want to target my remarks to our wonderful guest from Norwalk High School and just emphasize that you never know when your number is going to be called, so just be ready to throw down when it is. So I'm 25 years younger than my brother Jerry over here, and the reason it's relevant is he started off with his discussion of being at SC. So now let's fast forward a quarter century. And I'm opening up a letter of acceptance from UC Davis. And I'm excited, but what's accompanying that letter of acceptance is a conditional acceptance. Well, you must attend this summer orientation program. At that time, it was called STEP, Special Transition Enrichment Program. And because you don't quite meet the metrics of attendance, but you go through this program, and we'll let you in. We'll kind of get you a head start on the program. One of the most, probably the most meaningful point in all of my college education. And it was great there because in that context, the students, it was geared for students of color, so it was mostly Black, Latinx, Native American students. And it was some of the, sometimes I say the unspoken Asian Americans, right? So particularly, and I remember, I'm from Sacramento, and remember meeting students from Sacramento, Vietnamese, Hmong, kind of get lost in that story, if you say that, model minority group. So building community and just understanding that so many students were first gen, right? Didn't know the ins and outs of the institution. And I was so impressed and moved by that experience, I actually joined the, became a counselor for that program the subsequent year and was a member of our student, at that time it was called Student Affirmative Action Equal Opportunity Program office, and worked for that office for the duration of my time at UC Davis. And towards the end of that time at UC Davis, we had the campaign on Prop 209. And the efforts of that office were to really, it was a disinformation campaign. And when we talk about climate, it's interesting, as you mentioned, in 1993, we started to see some diversity in the UC campuses to start to resemble, I'd say, the California population. But again, there was pushback, strong pushback to those efforts. And so when I started at UC Davis, we were less than 4% Black students, about 12% Latinx students. In a state at that time that was well over a third Black and Latinx students combined, so less than half of that representation there. But for Pete Wilson and his ilk, that was too many, right? And hard-fought battle, we lost. And I was pretty sick of California at that time. I said, listen, I need to be around some folks who look like me, so next stop, ATL, right? Definitely looked a lot more folks like me. And at that point, my focus, one of the reasons I went to the South was to focus on capital work, as Jerry mentioned. Anyway, so not necessarily knowing or thinking that I'd be involved in any campaign to either overturn 209 or, again, any efforts to fight a larger, maybe repeal of affirmative action. All right, so then we fast forward, I end up going to law school. And I come to law school, and as Jerry mentioned, I learned all these statistical skills because I was in grad school, again, to be a death penalty litigator and deal with data, though, with the focus of bringing claims of racial discrimination and charging and sentencing in the capital process. Again, not thinking about work in the affirmative action context, but still, again, how can we use statistics to either support or contradict claims about the impact of race in various domains of decision making. But at my first year in law school, I know I saw Craig earlier. Throw your hand up, Craig. There you go. So Craig Futterman was faculty at my first year of law school at University of Chicago. And this article comes out. And for those of you who don't know what University of Chicago is, and New York Times one time called it one of the last bastions of white supremacy, okay? Not my words, this is the Times. So I'm there, and I'm not asking you to comment on that, Craig. But so an article comes out, and it's called The Systemic Analysis of Affirmative Action by a UCLA law professor by the name of Rick Sander. Now, notice that I'm a 1L, okay, at law school, and this is at a place that's been called, right, one of the last bastions of white supremacy. And the students who were anti-affirmative action at that time, and also, to be honest, as Jerry mentioned, subscribed to this view of kind of black and brown intellectual inferiority, they were walking around with the article as if it was a tablet that came down from a mountain, okay? How empowering it was to them, see, we always knew this, you don't deserve to be here. Now, unlike Harvard, University of Chicago is not 600 students per class, it's under 200. So in my class, who looked like me, about 13 students. You know, you mix black and brown students together, you know, maybe you get not quite 30 out of a class of 200. So you don't have a critical mass there at all. What you do have is a critical mass of students, probably white students, saying, see, this is the proof, right, that affirmative action wrong, you don't need to be here, you're taking up slots. All right? Now, all that training I did in statistical analysis, focusing on capital punishment, that was for that. Little did I know, though, however, when I'm talking to some of my fellow classmates, like, is this true? You could imagine this is proof, right? Most people come to law school, they don't like numbers. And I remember literally having, I still get emotional, but having sessions, a session with students of color, black and brown students at the law school, 1L, right? Not focusing on contract law, not focusing on property, but having a session like, I read this, I understand, I know the math, I know this is junk science. Okay, so now let me equip you with what you need to talk to these other students who are walking around like, ooh, holy grail, this guy, Rick Sanders, says that you shouldn't be here. Okay, but again, not fighting some larger legal battle against those who want to repeal affirmative action, but just, again, trying to equip those around me to say, we're in this place that is hostile to our presence here. We got to get through, but here's your, to use the young folks say, here's your clap back when you need some. All right? So, all right, that happens. Fast forward, pre-tenured faculty here at UCLA. Didn't know I was going to be here, did not I was going to be at a place where, you know, when I was a 1L, a professor here claimed to have this robust evidence of mismatch. And I'm pre-tenure, and here's the gear up. Here we go again, right? Now there's this, right, reinvigorated attack on affirmative action. I'm understanding the backdrop, what's going on with the students for quote-unquote fair admissions, right, the Harvard and UNC cases. And, you know, a workshop that comes up, and here's even more evidence that, right, black and brown students, again, don't deserve to be here. If they were at a lower school, they would learn more. New studies purporting to this. It was junk science then, it was junk science now. There's some people who might have been at those heated workshops. But I said, okay. I'm constantly finding myself in these positions where I need, right? And it doesn't be honest, to speak truth to power, right? To combat this junk science. And so it's not my wheelhouse, but you never know when your number's going to be called. And with that became comprehensive critiques, so I developed some comprehensive critiques of the methodology there. And what that would lead me to is to become a signatory of the Empirical Scholars Brief. Now, back to this prologue, it's important to talk a little bit about what the Empirical Scholars Brief is. Okay, so the Empirical Scholars Brief was a brief challenging this junk science about mismatch. Initially in the Texas case, it's called Fisher. So there was assault, just as Prop 209 abolished affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action in education institutions and any type of work with government employment or contracting. Also, in the Fisher case, Abigail Fisher, who was the plaintiff there, sued basically the University of Texas Austin for race-conscious admissions. And so you had a group of really the nation's foremost empirical scholars refute the provide a brief amicus brief, which is basically a brief to basically I'm trying to define amicus for our high school students, but a friend of a court brief or someone who has an interest in the case can provide additional information. They're not even like the named parties. They're not, X versus Y, but just somebody's interested in the case. And there was an empirical brief there. You would think that would have ended the discussion when you have some of the really foremost applied and theoretical statisticians in the country saying, no, mismatch is junk science. But the truth doesn't matter to people who don't care about the truth. They just want to push a narrative. And so, again, I'm just, in part for the community here at UCLA, saying, listen, I'm not going to let this junk science do to the effect that I saw it had on my classmates when I was a 1L, have on students here. And what ends up interesting happening is then these folks who didn't necessarily know all of them, had read my work on affirmative action and said, we need you to sign this brief in this, the Harvard and UNC cases, right? Your work, you are doing some, the cutting edge critique in this work. We need you to come on board. And at that time, Rick Sanders, Professor Sanders had produced another study that was very, very problematic. And I had happened to critique it early when no one else had actually done so. And so multiple critiques had come into that amicus brief. Interestingly about this, so as Jerry mentioned, the court ruled that educational institutions could not consider race in admissions. But as Jerry mentioned, there are three arguments, and they're related, and so I'll take a little time to talk about that later, but they're the related arguments. So one is, well, affirmative action is reverse discrimination. The second one is, well, and it's two parts. So there's the second and thirds are, well, it hurts students, but it hurts students in different ways. And so one of the claims is, well, because it's mismatched, they're outmatched. The other one is, well, there's stigma, right? So even if they're not outmatched, there's this stigma that you got a position that you, quote unquote, didn't deserve, so we want to talk about merit. And so, and these are the three arguments. The majority of the court, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of time parsing the opinion, but it's important that the majority of the court does not sign on to mismatch. It's only Clarence Thomas, only Justice Thomas who signs on to this mismatch argument, right? Despite the fact that the empirical scholars brief, right, and every reputable scholar who's addressed the issue says this is junk science. So the majority does not sign on to this. Now, this is important because it's not like this is a left-leaning court, okay? Anything that they could point to undermine affirmative action, they would, but they couldn't even touch it. And so Thomas is marginalized in this context, and then in exchange, Justice Sotomayor references nicely the empirical work of the empirical scholars brief and the work showing that that's junk science. Okay, and so that's how I found myself there and then find myself up here, right? Not with any explicit path that, oh, this is going to be work that I need to do, but rather the number is called in being able to answer that call. So let's talk a little bit about the brief. And it's important, and again, I won't get too much into the numbers, but I think it's important. One of the things that hasn't been, I think, fleshed out the way it should be is there's sometimes an express, but oftentimes implicit concession about what constitutes merit. And so the argument is, well, yeah, black and brown students, they might not have the same entering credentials. However, and these entering credentials may have merit, but because of both past and current discrimination, maybe they can't get the grades or can't have the test performance scores that would, quote unquote, have them comparable to their white counterparts. And that's a concession that must not be made. And it's important to understand why that must not be made. And it's also important to understand is how is that related to this claim about reverse discrimination. So we're at a law school, I'll talk about it in the law school context, but it also is applicable to the undergraduate context. So when we talk about merit for law schools, and these things are changing, it's important to think about why things are changing, but typically what law schools look at in terms of your numeric, we call it entering credentials, are your undergraduate GPA and something called the LSAT, right, which is law school aptitude test. I haven't spelled out the acronym in so long. It's either law school admissions test or law school aptitude test. I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. So, okay, thanks. What ends up happening is, so there's an argument, well, these metrics actually capture aptitude. And then the claim of mismatches in this aptitude is important for then legal learning. None of the data supports that. None of the data supports that. And let me explain, and it's two ways it doesn't support it. And I want to understand why, because it's a story that there's multiple problems along the chain that, again, when you actually tug at these strings, this mismatch argument falls apart. And so the first is we would think that if people had the same aptitude for the test itself, if the test was actually capturing what it's supposed to capture, if you compared individuals who are similar in terms of things, let's say, where they went to undergraduate school, their major, their GPA, when they graduated, so their socioeconomic status, then they would score similarly on this test. That's not the case. So some of the best research shows that black students score, all else being equal, about 9 points lower on the LSAT. Latinx students about 7 points lower on the LSAT. But actually, every group scores lower than white students on the LSAT. But it can't be explained by any of the things that should predict LSAT scores. That means the metric itself is racially biased. And it's important to keep this in mind because we're going to talk about reverse discrimination. So that's the first thing. The LSAT is not capturing what we think it would capture. But now let's just put to the side, okay, it's a problematic metric, but that's all we have in terms of its racial bias with respect to performance on that standardized test. But that standardized test is supposed to predict legal learning. So it should have a relationship to things like not only one's law school performance, but also things that matter more so than that. And so you don't go to law school to good grades, at least you shouldn't. You should go to law school because you want to be a lawyer. So things like passing the bar should matter more than that. And what we understand is two things that are very interesting. Those entry credentials predict a very, very small amount of what we saw the variance or differences in law school performance. So the thing that's supposed to predict law school performance, that's already racially tainted, doesn't even predict what it's supposed to predict if we just ignore the racial taint. Not only is that a problem, an additional problem is when you compare black and brown students to white students who have the same undergraduate GPA and LSAT, they perform lower on law school grades. But now, even with this problematic measure, and they're systematically scoring lower, when you compare them who actually score at the same level, they do worse on the grades, the law school grades. And then what's more interesting is, and now that's predicting bar passage when the studies are done correctly. But somehow we're still holding on to those metrics, right? Somehow it's still holding on to those metrics. Well, all the data shows they're racially biased in a way that hurts blacks and brown students, really all non-white students. They don't predict law school performance. They don't predict bar passage, and really don't predict career success. Not only that, when you look at the better conducted research, we have what we found a reverse mismatch effect, which actually students of color are benefited, right? Benefited by going to institutions that they would be quote unquote mismatched. And they're finding this both at the law school and undergraduate level. Right? And so this really brings attention, so to bring it back, because I've given you numbers, is what do we mean by merit? And more importantly, why are we so comfortable with a racially tainted measure of merit and don't constantly critique that? And this becomes important because even when we're in a regime that abandons race-based or race-conscious affirmative action, there's still an issue of, okay, well then what do we look at in terms of who do we bring in, right? How do we predict their performance? Right? And more importantly, if there's a case where we have measures that are of racial taint with respect to not only admissions tests, but also performance in law school, why is the attention not focused more on law school context? So let me give you one more piece of information outside of the race context, but I think it's very important for contextualization. So the late, great legal scholar Lonnie Grenier, who was a professor at Harvard, conducted a study and wrote a great book called Becoming Gentlemen. And Becoming Gentlemen was a study of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And what was found at the University of Pennsylvania Law School was that women had not just equal, but on average, better credentials than men at those schools, entering credentials, but performed lower on law school GPA, or not getting admitted to law review, and then had a bunch of other downstream ripple effects. Okay? But it couldn't be you weren't prepared or you were mismatched, because actually women were performing better on those entering credentials. And they looked at a lot of other things, study habits and other things, and nothing really explained it except what the focus was, well, when you actually did kind of the real more granular analysis and talked to the students, you had a hostile work environment. Not a lot of, surprise, right? Didn't have any women faculty. A lot of the way the instruction was done in a kind of gendered way that alienated women, and the way the Socratic method was conducted, right? And there wasn't really an accounting of that. But what you saw was change. Again, it hasn't been rectified, but you saw change when you started having critical mass of women professors, critical mass of female students at the law school. So But what we also, when we still look at some of the more current research is done at Harvard, University of Texas, Stanford, we still have these gender discrepancies, again, that can't be explained by quote-unquote mismatch, right? And so that conversation between when we talk about race and when we talk about gender, what does it mean for, when we talk about merit, and also why do we have quote-unquote underperformance, what that means in law school. There needs to be, again, a much more a rigorous kind of analysis and critique, all right, of what is going on in these law schools that are producing these results, what is going on when these standardized tests, which are constructed based largely these measures on what? They're being tested on white students. Why? Oh, surprise, it benefits, or there's advantage for white students who take the test. I know that was a lot of numbers, but hopefully that gives a nice picture. Jerry? I don't know if you have any follow-up questions.
No, I'm saving them. But so at the heart of all that, right, what some people talk about with the word merit, it's just the notion of like, well, who's qualified to do something?
That's right.
Think about anything, right? Think about who's qualified to be a sister. Not everybody. Who's qualified to be a parent? Who's qualified to be a good kid? Right? And then you go off into work life, right? Like, who's qualified and how do we figure that out, right? And one of the stunning things, I think especially when I started right fast filing employment discrimination lawsuits, was I realized how much not only law school didn't teach us, but law school didn't teach almost anything when I went. But how much all kinds of lawyers didn't know how anything worked. In other words, lawyers would file things without understanding how some outfit, organization, system worked. And not least was actually employment discrimination. Like, well, how do they decide something that Shauna had to face right away in the firefighters case way long ago? How do they decide who's qualified to be a firefighter? Only to discover, of course, that the idea of what they kind of qualified was like wacko and had almost nothing to do with what it was firefighters do. And Maisha's like a pro at this, right? So yes, she now works at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, but before that she worked at Wall Street. Then she worked with Aetna. So she's the only person on earth who always says to me, the ILRC's small, but the ILRC's now 60 people or something? Sin straighten me out, right? She also does work, right, with other human resources people, including black folks doing human resources, and finally, people who were previously locked up, the formerly incarcerated. So her whole mind is always wrapped around the idea of like, what are we calling qualifications? How do we get there? They really make the sense we think they make? What kind of biases, conscious and otherwise, are built into all that and built into everything from selection to promotion to dismissal, not getting tenure, but also just getting fired. So it's on you to tell us. And you cannot be polite.
That's a tall order, but I think I can handle it. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So we've already had such great conversation here today, so it's really exciting to even just be on this panel. And I think when we take things out of the academic context and put it into the actual workplace context, there are so many similarities, right? So for example, as Jerry's mentioning, so many different facets of HR. It's the hiring, it's the firing, it's promotions. For example, when I worked for Mount Sinai, I was there for 10 years when I lived in New York. And just seeing it in a different academic setting, right, a medical school, looking at professors who are looking to get tenure, looking at what undergrad and what medical school they came from, where they did their fellowship, all these things come into play. So whether or not we want to realize it or admit it, we really do have unconscious bias, and we're taking these things into play when we're deciding, hey, are we going to hire this person to be faculty or even to be admitted to our medical school? So these things are definitely happening out of the academic institution. And, so we look at performance from a school, right? Where did this person go to medical school? Do we think that's good enough, right? And who are we to decide what those qualifications are and if someone is good enough, right? We look at if we have a shared background, like, oh, we both went to X school, so they must be good because we have that commonality. But what does that really mean? That doesn't actually mean they're qualified, right? It just means we went to the same medical school. So that really doesn't mean anything. When we are writing job descriptions, how inclusive are these job descriptions? We really need to be focusing on the hard skills that someone can bring in, and also the soft skills, which are very important. But do we really look at those things? And most of us don't, again, whether we want to admit it or not. And, it's something that Dean Waterstone mentioned earlier, right? We're trying to come back from being on Zoom and just a very different way of living the past 3 years as we move through the pandemic to being back in person. And when we're looking at interviews, right? So we used to always do interviews in person. We would fly people out to various campuses so we could sit and meet with them. And then suddenly there's this huge shift and everything is on Zoom. Now there's another type of bias that crept into play, right? We're now seeing someone's family photos in the background. We're making judgments or comments just seeing a family photo. What does that even mean, right? If we hear a child crying or we hear a dog barking, like all of a sudden our brain starts making these things or making little notes. We're like, oh, young child, were they going to be able to put the work in, right? So all these things come up, again, whether or not we realize it. And it's important for us to actually realize it. Thinking about interview questions, do we have standardized interview questions? It's very concerning to me when I'm talking with friends or even other HR professionals, and I ask when we talk about their interviews, what does your interview process look like? What are your questions? And one of my friends, she actually, yesterday was her last day, but she worked at a very well-known retail corporate organization, which I will not mention the name, and when they do their interviews for their various teams, the people on the panel who are not HR professionals, even employment lawyers, they come up with the questions. And I'm like, okay, well, why are you answering these questions? What things are you actually hoping to accomplish and learn from these candidates? And are you asking everyone the same questions? And the answer is no. And that's terrifying as a person who's in HR, right? We want to make sure we're equalizing and leveling the playing field, and consistently we don't do that. And then another thing, where are we recruiting, right? So, Jerry, you mentioned that Harvard had a funnel to the HBCUs, right? And that's important, right? Like, if we're trying to build up these pipelines, how active are we doing in our recruitment? Where are we going? What schools are we looking at? And are we setting people up for success? And oftentimes we're not, right? So I remember, I know I'm on a Bruin campus, but I'm a proud anteater. I just want to put that out there.
UC Irvine.
Yes, sorry. And we had a program similar to what you went through, Sherrod, and it was called the CAMP program. And so it was a California Alliance for Minority Participation, and that was for those who were in the STEM world. And then I believe the counterpart, I think, was Bridge program, and that was for those who were in social sciences. And so my first couple of years at Irvine, I was an aerospace engineering major, right? So very rigorous program. There was a lot happening.
You never told me that.
You learn something new every day, right? And so I was in that program, and the questions I look back now and ask myself, was I really set up for success, right? And there were programs that were available to me, but part of it was ego. Part of it, I was out from under my parents' thumb. I wanted to socialize. I didn't take advantage of those resources, right, that could have set me up for success. But I actually don't know if those resources would have set me up because I never actually I never sought out tutoring, right? So I was a part of NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers. And so I used the tutors with my NSBE friends because I already knew them, right? Something else you didn't know?
No.
But really, are we setting people up for success, right? And I think that's very important. And so I'm kind of all over the place, I realize that. But just looking back in the workplace, when we are if we're setting someone up for success, do we provide adequate training, right? And that's pretty subjective, right? Like what Jerry might think is adequate, Sherrod might have a different opinion, and I have a different opinion altogether, right? So what is adequate training? So just kind of tying it into the ILRC, when we're hiring, not only do we have a very extensive hiring process, which takes a while, yes, admittedly, but we do it because we want to make sure we're finding the candidate who not only can do the job, but also is a good culture fit, right? And even that word is loaded, that term, culture fit, right? What does that really mean? And we do our best to make sure we're hiring folks who kind of not only believe in the mission of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, right? That's first and foremost. We want people who are mission-driven. We want people who are passionate about the work. And we want people who really want to be here, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not just a job. We want people to just really enjoy their colleagues. And, I'm fortunate to have 3 of my amazing colleagues here. And I think I'm speaking for all of you, and that we enjoy showing up to work every day. Like, we enjoy what we do. That's why we've been at the organization for so long, and we want to make sure other people come in and have that opportunity. Also, when you're setting people up for success and even having a pipeline, are there the right professional development opportunities, right? That's very important. And what does that even look like, right? So with staff, we're trying to do a better job at offering professional development opportunities. And I do realize that we are in a unique situation because professional development oftentimes needs to be funded, right? And so if organizations don't necessarily have the budget to do that, it might be harder, but there are ways to be creative about offering professional development opportunities. Mentorship. That's something else that we can offer to help set up individuals for success. And everyone is busy, right? That doesn't matter like where you are at age and career and things like that. But if we are able to provide mentorship for folks, that can also help them go a long way. It is amazing when you're able to see someone who looks like you in the workplace, and even better to have someone who is mentoring you who looks like you, right? It's the world of a difference because suddenly we have a shared experience that Jerry and I might not have. We're going to have some because we're people of color, but not the same experiences that, for example, Sherrod and I are going to have. And onboarding. So for me personally, in many of my jobs, I spend a lot of time onboarding individuals, right? A lot of organizations, they're just like, okay, here's your first day packet. Let's do a couple of meetings with your supervisor and kind of set you free, right? Is that really working? So for me personally, it might be overkill, but I tend to spend the first 6 weeks meeting with that new person every single day, which is a huge investment on time, but at the end of the day, it's worth it, right? Because you have that return on investment. People really understand what it's like to work at that organization, the culture that they're coming into, what is truly expected of them so that they can succeed. So that's just a kind of snippet. I'll pause to see if you want to ask any questions.
So yeah, I do have a question, right? Here's just a little bit of backdrop. Like when I had been outside of East LA some as a kid, and it was almost always for competition, right? So it was about sports mainly, in every kind of sport, and very seriously, and the county of LA and even the county of Orange County. And then my elementary school teachers, very much against my will, would put me into singing contests, spelling bees, and speaking contests. And my job was to win. That's what I was sent off with. Go win. But one of the things I kind of noticed as I got out there was I kind of said, like, the rest of this part of LA that everybody treats like it's so gifted and different than the people in Watts and the people in Gardena and the people in East LA is like, now that I've competed against them, I kind of don't get all this. I'm being blunt with you. This is not my 272-year-old view. This is like I was a kid going like, this is all the big deal is about? This is what, if I would have had a word, I would have said like, you think I'm mismatched? Right? And when I thought a lot about it, particularly in employment discrimination stuff, but then a lot in 209, I used to say like, every job, say, must be part like, are you already qualified? And also training to get exactly where we need you to get to be qualified to be here, right? And I've never known a really healthy place that didn't just say, oh, Bill Hing, you're qualified, let you free. As opposed to like, he might have the most sterling credentials ever, be like, do you know how we work, right? Bring all your talent, right? But we're gonna, and so I always thought that like people weren't forthright about that, right? When they were making anti-affirmative action arguments, it was something like, well, this is meant to be harsh competition. Do you have what it takes or not? That kind of throw down male shit, right? Do you have what it takes or not? And I was built that way as a kid, so let's understand that, right? You want to throw down, let's throw down. But the big thing I saw was like, all kinds of you aren't ready to throw down. And actually, that's not so crazy. Everybody's got to learn to throw down, even the ones who are kind of sent out to do the battling. So that when you're talking about things like, okay, how do we imagine qualifications? It almost seems to me that you almost should build in the notion of it's qualified to, with our help, be prepared / train to be here and be as good as you can be. That's true of a job, right? That's true of school, right? I have two of the great, people who are in law school who provide what's called in law school academic support, right? So for people that, the law school sometimes say, well, we're not certain you'll quite make it, it's disproportionately people of color, but they're such astounding teachers, right? but all kinds of people with purest higher numbers want to get into their class. Well, that's because, of course, those people get most of all that what you're doing is training people to be here and succeed. So that they teach in a way that every astute law student says, like, I'm going there. Forget about my, perfect score in the LSAT. Forget about my 4 point, what numbers do you guys get now? 4.7.3. Whatever the hell it is. They just go like, I'm going to somebody who thinks they're supposed to train me to be here. And I wonder like how much either at the ILRC or in any of the earlier stuff, people talked about that actively. You must, otherwise you wouldn't think that, quote unquote, onboarding takes so long and so much. But it must be that you understand that's part of what's going on.
Definitely, and I think part of it is I've been in the field for so long and have worked in so many different institutions and organizations. I know what I was taught, right, and I see what has worked and what hasn't worked, and so I've made adjustments on the job to kind of get me here where I am now, where I can say, okay, we need to spend a lot of time onboarding. We need to really look at where we're recruiting from. What are the things that we're really looking for? Like, I know a lot of times, I'm sure you all have seen, like on the job description, similar to what you're saying, Jerry, a recent grad with at least 5 years of experience. Like, that, make it make sense, right? That doesn't work, right? And so what are we really looking for? And how can we help support people, right? Because are you looking for a recent grad? And if so, there's learning that's going to have to happen. Even if you're looking for someone with 10 years of experience, there's learning that has to happen, right? The learning never ends no matter where you are in your career, because you have to adjust and pivot for the type of workplace that you're in. I think I answered your question. I'm not entirely clear.
Well, no, so I guess take that one, right? I had a discussion with somebody here in the room. He was one of my favorite people of all time, and he was telling me about a new possibility opening up where he works, and he wants to be special about it, right? And so he suddenly threw out to me like, I did this, and I forget the number of years. Was it 8 years or something like that? And I said, this has always been my view. What the hell does that even mean? I mean, I know people with 72 years of experience on the job, and they don't know shit. And I know people who are just beginning, and they're just remarkable learners on the fly. Now, it turns out he had a phenomenal explanation, right? It was about sending signals to a bunch of other people. But I never even get the 5 years. Well, what does 5 years mean? Like, no, I'm not teasing for all you kids who think I'm messing around. I think it's meaningless. Like, what you really want to know is, like, have you learned shit during those 5 years? Because we're going to bust your ass while we talk to you and watching you to see if that's true. And if you're not willing to say that, then what the heck are you saying? Oh, you've gotten older. That's a great thing. Right? So, like, do you talk about that a lot?
Sometimes, to be perfectly honest, sometimes. Because it 5 years can mean 5 years. 5 years in the field doing direct services means one thing. 5 years doing policy work means a different thing, right? So it's also looking at the job you're trying to fill and figuring out what type of experience are you looking for? And I think we don't always ask that question, and we really need to start asking that question in order to kind of help bridge these gaps and put the right individuals in the right positions. And then taking it, kind of blowing it out just a little bit, even when we're looking at resumes, right, there needs to be a better practice of redacting information, right? So redacting a person's education, redacting their name even, right? Like Maisha, that's a pretty stereotypical black name, right? Do people know the meaning behind it? It's Swahili. It means life. People don't typically know that, right? But if you see my name, most people automatically say, oh, she's black. So does that mean my resume ends up in the circular file? I don't know. Who knows what jobs I applied for but didn't get because they saw that, right? Start redacting the information so we're truly looking at what a person is actually bringing to the table.
This is like ban the box expanded.
Yes, yeah.
So you know what ban the box is? Everybody? If you don't know, just say, I don't know what the hell that is.
So ban the box in California essentially means that an employer cannot use an arrest or conviction against you prior to making a job offer. So this was huge. I think it came into play, I want to say in 2018, but don't quote me on that.
And the movement started much earlier.
Yes, yes. And so that was a huge step for California because previously, many of you are old enough to remember, many of you not. But, as you're filling out a job application, there was a box that said, have you ever been arrested or have you ever been convicted? And so really, if you're being truthful in your application, you need to mark yes. And so if the person on the receiving end gets that, they're like, ooh, we don't know what necessarily you've been arrested or convicted for. We just know that you marked that box. We're going to tear up your application, and that's the end of it, right? So many individuals were denied an opportunity to even be screened, even be interviewed, let alone have a job offer because of that box. So thankfully it's not there. It's not to say that people still don't operate in an unethical way, but this was definitely a great stride to mitigate that.
I want to add a little something. I don't want to be a downer here, but I think it's interesting to.
You're never a downer like that.
So, relevant to the issue about ban the box, and then I want to circle back to something you said and about academic support. And so, didn't you think about ban the box? So there was some great research done. I'll be a little softer with the numbers here, but great book called Marked. If you, it's by now deceased a great sociologist by the name of Diva Pager. And it started off as a study in Wisconsin, and then it ended up, I think, Milwaukee, and then it ended up expanding to other sites. And actually, during his presidential bid years ago, Howard Dean, who had been a front runner for a little bit, had actually referenced this study. One of the very few times some good social science gets references by a politician. At that time, he was actually a front runner for the Democratic nomination for president. And what Pager and her colleagues found out, which is very interesting and very disturbing, is they basically had these kind of fake resumes, black and brown, and they black and white. Then they also expanded to Latinx in some other cities. And what they found was that a white person with a criminal record was more likely to get a callback than a black person without a criminal record, all else being equal. All else being equal. This was replicated across many studies. So even when you don't have a criminal conviction, your race is used against you. So this is not to say that we shouldn't have efforts as ban the box. We should, but we also understand the limitations of that, because when race itself becomes a proxy for criminality, when it becomes a proxy for intellectual inferiority, right? That's the really need when we talk about a race-conscious remedy. Why? Because it's a race-conscious discrimination. It's a race-conscious impediment. So how can you not reverse that without a race-conscious remedy? That's the first thing. Now let's talk about quasi-race neutral, race-conscious remedies, because you still get pushback. So now I'm going to bring in academic support. And don't worry, I'm going to do it in a nice way. So I've actually, there's an excellent program that Patrick and others have developed here at UCLA, which is called Introduction to Legal Analysis Law 101. I taught it for 3 years, if you might remember. Loved the course. Actually learned a lot about teaching myself. I mean, I don't know if I ever told you that person. I really thank you for that. About relating to students, and really, I think particularly what was so helpful, we come to school, and particularly those from marginalized communities, you just don't have the background. You don't have that kind of generational capital privilege. When I think about law school, and I've never had it when I was a student or here, what I would say kind of imposter syndrome. But I'm going to tell you when I felt most insecure is when I'm next to a classmate in law school, and he's like, oh, yeah, by the way, yeah, I know this case because, my father clerked for Justice Powell on this case. Oh, yeah, my grandfather litigated this famous property case. Now, if it was a black person, I would have been, but it's like, of course, that never came from somebody who was black or brown in those cases. But that is what you are dealing with. That is the gap, right, that you have to, we talk about the training, right? Now, the interesting thing we know about academic support, because, again, no good deeds goes unpunished. So there is pushback from students who aren't in academic support about academic support. Oh, that's cheating. No, that's removing certain people from the class or here, so it's not necessarily fair. So even when you think about something that's remedial, that's not race-based. It might have a correlation, but it's not race-based. There's still that pushback. And this is important because when I said before, we talk about reverse discrimination. But you have a measure of merit that's pregnant with discrimination, and that's fine. If it advantages white folks, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Right, but when there's something that's remedial for, let's say it's race neutral, that's correlated with race, oh, that's unfair, there's a leg up. All right, sorry.
So I wasn't going to have us talk about this, right? But since you mentioned it, right, I genuinely didn't quite know what people of color or women or working class whites may have meant when they said imposter syndrome. When that first became the language, right, which kind of like, geez, I feel like an imposter being here, like I shouldn't be here, and not just because I'm a woman or of color, like, do I really measure up, right? And I as I said, the greatest thing that ever happened was seeing all of LA and saying, really, that's all there is? right? And nothing's ever changed about any single experience I've had. You can talk about any and all experiences I've had. And I said, really? That's what all the hoopla-da's about? I'm just being blunt. I'm assessing like a coach would. Like, that's it? That's all you got? And the flip is also true, right? I mean, there's people in this room who I've had the honor of working with and teaching. I mean, they were ready to go as soon as I met them. You know, this idea that I somehow had this big influence is so oversold, right? They were like, no, it's true. This is not false modesty. I'm plenty confident. And all of you who know me well know that. But I'm just telling you, like, okay, you know, like, I'll stand out of your way, guide you a little bit like anybody would, but like, you're ready to roar. Whereas I was not ready to roar, right? I was ready to be feral, which I was for a lot of years, right? I was lucky they didn't have the box that said, should have been arrested. If they had that box, Lord Almighty. But I needed somebody somewhere, right? And I found it in other places and just a little bit in formal education, but mainly in other places, right? But some of you are just like ready to go, right? And so we should talk about it more because I remain utterly baffled why anybody doesn't walk into a place and say like, honest to God, that's all there is. And I think I could detrain somebody out of that in no time at all. Both to explain what it is people are doing instead of having it all be mystified, number one. How you do it that they're not teaching you, number two. And three, like, that's all there is? Because the real stuff is not about what law school's mainly about or the testing of you. The real stuff is like working with people. And it gets all the harder if you think you're doing it radical. When Gina's talking honestly about, oh my God, I love this, but geez, let me not even begin to tell you just how rough it is to work with people. Which is probably why some people run away from working with people, right? Because it's both beautiful and rough. Now, I don't know that that's any different from having family or friends. So I don't know why this distinction's always drawn. But like some people are ready for that already. Gina was ready. I didn't do nothing to help Gina. Don't you argue. She's very good at arguing. She was just ready. You know, you just kind of stay out of the way, let her get hot, throw down. But you should talk about it, right? Because there must be people in the room who are just like, they weren't lucky enough to grow up in East LA. Where you were in it. Maybe LA is just mediocre. So when I went outside the boundaries, it's like, well, the whole LA County and Orange County is just mediocre. That's what you saw. But you should talk about it because it's real. And so what the hell is it?
It's interesting. I mean, I'll say this, and I don't want to quote be a dead horse, but when you believe in the flawed metrics that work against you, that helps generate that.
Okay.
Right? When you say, well, actually, because I didn't get this standardized test score, that means I'm not as smart. Even if you say, yeah, but I understand there's this whole legacy that's prevented me from access to the resource that would allow me to perform better. When you believe in that. So here's something interesting. I'm sorry, again, I go back to the social science, right? One of the things that they discovered is black students who attended black law schools at historically black colleges performed better on the bar than would be predicted. They overperformed at the black schools and underperformed at the white schools. But here's the thing, and the numbers are smaller, but white students underperformed at the black schools and and performed as they should at the white schools with the numbers, right? Or at least that would be predicted. But so it says something about context, right? It says something about context. Man, that doesn't get picked up upon, right? And so part of it also is, again, I think it's when you see yourself reflected in the student body, in your faculty. Other interesting things. So there's a lot of different comparisons about against schools and their graduation, law schools and their graduation rates and their bar passage rates. And there are studies that were looking in the same city that looked, or the same state, so you can take into account of the different bar examinations. And what they focused on was, well, how are the students performing at the historically black college or black students as, again, the predominantly white schools? Right. And it was interesting because two things really kind of results came out. Again, one, you saw better performance at those schools. But what's interesting, again, and I'll even say something about this imposter syndrome, which is a little bit related. A lot of the predominantly white schools were for-profit schools that targeted the black students, right? Particularly at the undergraduate level, at the historically black colleges at the undergraduate level to come to those schools, but were giving them inadequate educations. But a lot of those students, because you can buy into the hype, it must be a better school because it's this predominantly white institution. So you're actually getting a worse education there, right? But again, it's why? Because you believe that you're getting it's a better product. So this false belief in, I guess, the quality of the metrics of merit or the quality of an institution, I think plays a role.
A couple of things. So actually, Sharad, you mentioned something previously on just the callback rates for those who've been incarcerated. So I think we probably are talking about the same study, but white people are 7 times more likely to get a callback than a black person. 7 times. Like, I just really want to underscore the data, right? That's huge, right? And the number, I don't know, for me, I feel like that study was in 2017, so I don't know.
There's been several limitations, but
Okay.
I'm with you.
Okay. So I'm guessing it's gotten worse, unfortunately, since then. But kind of moving over to also what you were just mentioning, and then also moving to imposter syndrome. So I don't know, I mean, I guess I know, right? It's society, and Jerry's heard me say this story before, but when I was applying to colleges and universities, I had in my head certain schools are where I needed to be. Now, where that came, I mean, granted, my dad and my uncle and my aunt and my cousin, they were all UC family, but my dad and my uncle went here. They went to UC Irvine. My dad did his undergrad and grad in chemical engineering, and my uncle did his undergrad in biology and then went on to UCSD for his medical degree and his MPH, right? So we're just a very UC-centric family. But when I didn't get into UCLA, I mean, I lost my mind. Like, I just thought that was the worst thing that could have happened to me, right? I got into UC Irvine, which is a very highly regarded school, but in my mind, I was setting it and pitting it up next to University of California, Los Angeles. So where did that come from, right? I got into University of Michigan. I got into Annapolis. Nothing to sneeze at for any of these programs, but I was like in tears, literally, because I didn't get into this campus. So where did that come from? And then once I thought about it, I was like, wait, it's UCI. Like, UCI is a phenomenal school. Like, we're highly ranked. And we have to really stop teaching ourselves and telling ourselves these things that we're not as good as because we didn't get into X school. It's really important to start undoing that narrative. And then shifting to imposter syndrome, going back to when I worked at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, when I became an administrator, I don't want to say it happened by chance because it didn't really. Like, I was well qualified for the position. My predecessor was leaving. I'd actually already resigned because I was going to move to DC because I thought that made sense at the time. And my division chief said, do you want to be the administrator? And what does that even mean, right? And so basically you are the number 2 person in the division. In this case, it was hepatology, so liver diseases. And you're running the division alongside your chief. And I said, okay, sure. Not really sure what I'm getting myself into. Once I got the position, I was the least qualified, and I do use air quotes on that because I did not have the same education that my counterparts did, meaning I did not have a graduate degree. I had no formal training in hospital administration, but obviously I belonged to be there because I got the job, but I very much had imposter syndrome because I'm like, oh, I'm not as good as, right, my counterparts. And that becomes very dangerous, right? So again, we have to start undoing these things that we're taught. As time went on, I got more and more comfortable in the role. I knew what I was doing. I got certification in business finance, and I really got comfortable. I was like, well, of course I belong here, right? Why wouldn't I, right? But I was also the youngest person for the Department of Medicine in that position. So you have all these things that really start to kind of eat at you, and you have to, again, really counteract these things because you do belong. You're not an imposter, which I think is very important to note. Then as I moved on and got promoted, then I went to cardiology, a much larger division, right, and became a director there. Imposter syndrome crept right back up, even though I knew I belonged. I had been handpicked. Someone said, go after Maisha for this role. So I knew I belonged, but I was like, oh, I don't know. And so imposter syndrome is very real. And I'm being repetitive in the sense that we really have to start undoing that rhetoric that we're taught because it has very damaging effects, whether or not we want to take that into account.
Wow.
Something new again.
So, there may have been a way in which, I know this is going to sound like a strange comment, right? So when we went to school, there was almost nobody or nobody who looked like us. And you would have said, tragic. Well, I think it's tragic because ridiculous numbers of people were good enough to be there. But for me, I didn't give a shit beyond that. Because the more I paid attention to these people, I said, just come to my house and listen to my mom and dad, who barely got out of high school after Mexico in a mining town. And you want to hear people who are no fancy words and dig right deep. So where I was looking for my comparisons was not the front of the classroom, but the big broad world of people that I knew. And it wasn't just limited to my mom and dad, right? I just looked all around and said it's that woman there, it's that woman back there. See that guy who looks Puerto Rican, what the hell's he doing in California? That's real actually right now. Right, what's up? And you got to find it in different places, right? I know ultimately we're talking about finding in our hearts, and I love the fact that those of you who have had more people who look like you have it. But I think in a strange way it's made it more complicated. We had no expectations, and that's what we found. Yeah. But it's cleaner. It's cleaner, right? It was just, remember, during that period, just to be real, right? I mean, Watts and the Watts riots, black folks like Mexicans were regarded as criminal, right? And Chinese and Japanese were regarded as some do drugs and I don't know what else, and the others are untrustworthy, though there's no proof of it. And by the way, none of them people owned land until 1952, right? And so having no expectations turns out to be, in many ways, a liberating thing. I don't mean to be silly, right? But the more it builds up, then there's more do I measure up, do I not, right? So I'll make a slightly bigger point, which some of you have heard me make to you, right? So first of all, let me repeat. Some of you that I had the honor of having were so ready already. I would just listen, watch, and learn. Honest to God. And those who were more like me, so there's more I had to do, particularly if you happen to be feral, then there's a lot of let's figure this out, right? But I became convinced of something that a smaller number of you are true. I used to teach a lot of things that amounted to this is what law school is really about, blah, blah, this is what the test is about. And then I stopped all that because I did clinical stuff so intensely that the work was mainly within clinical stuff. And then I returned at the behest of a small number of people in this room to teach, strictly speaking, what the hell is legal analysis, which you high school students should know is treated like it's special. It's sacrosanct, and no one else thinks this way. This is talk about junk science. That's the biggest lie in the history of professions, right? So I then said, okay, I'll gear back up. And there was a set of students. I said, but you got to work hard because I'm nasty. I throw down, but if you're not willing to throw down, I'm into sweat labor. And you all know that who know me, right? So I said, you got to throw in big. But look, I will not only demystify it, but it's not just a critique. I'll teach you exactly what's going on here and how to reproduce it. And you'll not only be able practically to do it, you'll intellectually understand what's going on, as well as start saying, really, that's all there is? But I'll go further. If I take your students, I don't know exactly how long it would be, I could teach them to pass the bar right now in high school. You now know how cocky I am. But it's not about me, right? It's about how much I know you can do what you're trained to do. So the old story used to be oh, it's so complicated, I can't explain it legally, how are you going to explain that to a client? You know what? If you hear that from a medical type, a doctor, or anybody else, then you know it's the professional who's no good. Right? If you can't talk to a reasonably interested 11-year-old to make them understand everything, you know whose fault it is? It ain't the 11-year-old. I've tried this out all my damn life. Right? So the imposter stuff is not just they don't look like us or I wonder. is that the places that are supposedly to be great at training you, that's what education means, right, are pathetic, with exceptions. And sometimes those exceptions get more credit than they're due because it's the students who come to them who are already great, and you go like, oh yeah, I helped to create her. What the hell are you talking about? They came to you like that. What you didn't do is drive them off the Santa Monica Pier. That's your greatest strength, right? But I could take the Norwalk kids and teach them to pass the bar. So if we want to skip all the other stuff, we can just go ahead and do that. And I think that's a lot that doesn't go on, and we don't like dig beneath the surface. Everybody's like treating like it all can go along is the same, and it's all the trouble with the kids, and what are the metrics and all that. Like, what if we just fired all the faculty and started afresh at a bunch of levels? And of course, what wealth does is permit you to get tutoring. It doesn't always come from your parents. So I remember this cat I knew in law school, right, who was a great white dude I used to play blues guitar with, right? He was a good musician. And he went to the fanciest of fancy prep schools in the old school style, where literally everything they wrote got critiqued every night. They wrote for math every night. So, you know, they put us in some appellate thing, right? And I was wild and didn't go to class, didn't know what it was. And then he kind of said, well, what you turned in to me, like, he's my partner. He's got a lot of good ideas, Jer. But you know me, I was like, well, good, it's got good ideas. I'm good with that. Let's roll. We get to the oral part now. And then he was so gentle in training me up about why it should look like a brief, right? And he was so good. And then he said, I want you to know this isn't me and natural talent and my whiteness. You know, I've been trained up. I could have done all this my sophomore year in high school because that's all they trained us to do. So you're watching a really trained up cat. In fact, he made this great argument. He said, I don't even know how talented I am. And that's great training, where you say, is it really me or is it really great training? And I think a lot of that would go to all this, right? So like you wouldn't walk around with, you know, crap teachers in a crap institution looking for something that makes sense, being confused by the signals, but actually get trained up about the very thing that you feel insecure about. And suddenly start saying, well, like, wow, look at that. I can fly. On some days, I can fly. Whether you're locked up in prison or not. Right there. If you got that woman teaching you, you're going to figure out you can fly when you're locked up.
Two things, though, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, so I agree. Money, resources get you tutoring. But what we also know from Varsity Blues, it also gets the folks to take the test for you. What we also know from Varsity Blues, it right gets them to correct and change the test. What we also know from the Varsity Blues, and I'll say what Varsity Blues in a second, it gets you a fake sports profile so you can get into UCLA and USC. So Varsity Blues was a big scandal, right? One of the big bad actors were here at UCLA. One of the other big bad actors at USC. I don't know how Jerry's connected to both institutions. What's your role in all this? And was an athlete, but anyway. But basically, for those who are familiar with it, rich, very famous people, right? Right, Felicity Huffman, all like very, very famous people were paying various ways, but were paying a person to get their kids into schools and with various mechanisms. And one was to give them fake sports profiles, and then they were in cahoots with coaches and paying coaches. And this went all over the country. UCLA, USC, Harvard, you name it. Never played sports to get in, to get a sports admissions preference. And that's a whole other thing about sports admissions preference that we could talk about maybe another time. So that's important. And another thing I want to say is, so money gets you that. Also, money and connections get you something that's tutoring, but in a way that kind of sinister tutoring. And I remember coming across I had a neighbor who taught in these private schools, and what happened was, she told me, is the parents would get the lesson plan for the next year. And that summer would teach their kids, this small group, the lesson plan. So everything becomes review. So when you think that kid's next year was kicking your butt in school, well, yeah, because this is all review, because he did the same test and the whole assignment this whole summer, that previous summer. Right? That's what money gets you as well. That's why I said you got to question the metrics. And I know, the young folks, y'all love, this is a phrase I love slang, but I don't like y'all overuse this. High school is just stop the cap. Y'all like that? All right. Y'all got to switch it up at some point. but here's the thing I'll say about stop the cap. What, and this is relevant. I'm sure some of you might want to go to schools here in the UC system. Great study came out looking at all these UC applicants. They said, well, let's see how much entry credentials matter for explaining your undergraduate GPA. How much does it really matter? At UC schools. At UC schools. Huge data, hundreds of thousands of applicants, students. And what they found out, once you took into account high school contacts, right? Did you come from a poor school? What kind of resources? It explained about 3% of the variance in grades, which is basically nothing. So think about stop the cap. Partly stop the cap to try to make me feel as if I'm an imposter, right? Stop the cap to say you didn't have these unfair advantages, and so I come into these institutions, not unable to perform, but yeah, needing maybe a little more time to catch up. Why? Because you got a head start, because your parents paid for everything for you.
And I do kind of want to shift back to employment barriers for the formerly incarcerated for a second, and it goes back to, Jerry, what you started with who's qualified, right? And so I really want us to think a lot about the employment barriers that are in place for those who have been touched by our carceral system. So, for example, and this is what I speak with organizations about when they're very interested in hiring from this population, but going back to, are they setting these individuals up for success? Is the organization, are they ready for this type of shift? Is the work site accessible? And when I say accessible, I don't mean necessarily ADA, but I'm saying how close is it to public transportation, right? So if you're coming out of prison, you probably don't have a license, right? And so do you even know how to get a license? Can you get a license, right? So driving to the work site, which many of us do and really think nothing about it, that's not an option. So is your work site accessible? Thinking about second and third shift consideration. So for example, if you have someone working a 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, if they have curfew and they have to check in with their parole officer, this isn't gonna work for them, right? So how can we help remove those barriers? Is there a different shift that we can put them on? If the person is needed to travel to different work sites. Well, in California, you need to let your parole officer know if you're going to be traveling more than 50 miles. In California, 50 miles is nothing for us. Maybe not in LA, it takes you 5 hours to travel 50 miles. But normally, that's something to take into consideration. And then from a business standpoint, are you providing the right type of coaching and transparency, right? So people are like, oh, yeah, the formerly incarcerated coming to work with us. What does that mean? But what does that actually mean, right? How to have those open conversations. There are protections for businesses to actually incentivize them to hire from this population, right? So they have insurance bonds that you can get to a certain amount, which protects the organization if something were to happen. And that's not to say that we expect something to happen, but if it does happen, just like we have workers' comp, like we have these general insurances just anyways. So it goes back to qualifications. Who's really qualified, right? So maybe if you are interested in hiring folks who have been incarcerated, and you have someone, maybe, I don't know, I'm just making this up, but you're a financial institution, right? And you have someone who was convicted, and you're having that open conversation with them to see what their conviction was. And if it was embezzlement, okay, so maybe you don't want to have them working directly and seeing clients' information or working as a teller, right? There are other jobs, because they are qualified to do other things within that organization, that you can hire them for. So just saying, oh, they were formerly incarcerated, I can't have them work at a financial institution, isn't the right way to go, right? Let's think about it. Let's really start having those conversations that we need to have to really help this population, because there are so many barriers. There's the housing barriers that they face, which I'm not an expert in. We have experts in that, and I'm just learning about those, and those are scary. So let's just try and help bring down some of those barriers, starting with employment. So I just kind of wanted to end with that.
So this is related, I guess, to this imposter thing that's deep and troubles me. So I told you all right that California's already lived, but the rest of the nation is now going to unfold and live. And when I knew it was coming up and how nasty it was, I took a set of students, and on top of the regular teaching load, I taught them for a year how to understand the history of affirmative action. And then the next year, we went up and down the state debating with people who were pro. Now, we pretty much knew we were going to get our ass kicked on the vote, but this was like, you fight hard, hope for the best, plan for the worst, which is what we did. And one of the great organizations actually that hosted a lot of this was the League of Women Voters. Now, they were harsh debates, right? But a very common question at the time was like, and it's true because people were saying this, and it's true because it was in one Supreme Court opinion, but it amounted to like, well, how long do we need race-conscious affirmative action? How long do we need, gender-conscious affirmative action? And I was just baffled by that, right? And so I started telling the truth. I said, here's the truth. I have no idea how long, but I'll tell you when I can tell. It's not just when the numbers in any school, in any employment, any contractors match the population, right? Here's my real signal. When I see as many mediocre and really poor women and mediocre and really poor folks of color who match for thousands of years the terrible and mediocre white men, we will have arrived. That's not a lie. That's not a lie. Why? Because we're as fully human as they are. So that we're going to be across a range, and there's going to be some who are mind-boggling, some who are excellent, all the way down to some who just ain't doing it well. But I know that in the same numbers, when I see that for a long, long, long time, as all of history has brought us white men, free, free, free at last. Thank you. Thank you. So Bill Hing, what room? Right next to you. Going to do it?
You can say.
There's a Bill Hing has written a new book, and
So I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes at 13:37. That should be your last option. Okay, you should go to the reception.
no, but it's a new book, and it's a fabulous book, and it's really about why we should abolish ICE. And it combines, Bill Hing is the best all-around immigration lawyer in the country. I mean, that's not even a contest. But this is a, part memoir, which means, of course, it's nitty-gritty real. And though it's the subtitle, and I would have reversed it and made it the title, that's what it's about. So in 1337,
I think it's a few doors down here.
yeah, so know that, and thank you all very much. And you folks from Norwalk knocked me out. And tomorrow it may well be that we have preschool kids, right? So my heart will go pitter-patter today. So thank you, and we'll go pitter-patter tomorrow. And all of you, I love you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to those of you who were able to join us today. We will have a small reception outside. Hopefully, we also see most of you back here tomorrow. We would really appreciate it if you could hold on to your programs if you're coming back tomorrow to save the trees. And we will start registration at 8:30 and begin at 9:30. So we'll see you tomorrow.